Let's do it.
So I'm doing Samael and Startail.
A lot of this is like Milton. I'm just so into this world building stuff. Oh my God, there's so many that are just like, oh, this is the angel of Thursday. And you're like, okay, good one. What does that even mean? If you're the angel of Thursday, what do you do as a job? You know?
Hello and welcome to One Cool Thing, a podcast from indie game studio Die Gute Fabrik, hosted by me, Hannah Nicklin. One Cool Thing is a podcast speaking with people in and around video games about one cool thing not from games, which is really fascinating them right now. We'll introduce them and their practice, talk about the cool thing they've brought to the conversation, and consider how it shapes about how they think about their work. It's a chance to hear more about the practices of cool folks working in games, and hopefully somewhere where we can all reflect on how we think about how we make things. So, without further ado, let's meet our next guest.
Lilith. In Jewish tradition, where she originated, Lilith is a female demon, enemy of infants, bride of the evil angel Samael, in brackets Satan. She predated Eve, had marital relations with Adam, and must thus be regarded as our first parent's first wife.
So, welcome to Cara Ellison. Cara Ellison is a Scottish designer and writer for video games, who also writes for TV and comics. Before working in game dev, Cara was a journalist and worked in books, comics, and radio. Her website explains, most of all, she's interested in expanding ideas of what interactive entertainment can do and who it's for. Recent projects include technical narrative design on God of War Ragnarok, writing for the final Girls comic series, and lots of different story design on things like Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, and also narrative design, world building, and writing on indie game Void Bastards, which was a really stylish thing that came out around the same time as Mutasionia. I think it was 2019. She currently works full-time with Sony over in the USA. I obviously love and admire a lot of Cara's work, but a particular highlight of her journalism for me, which I think is super not well enough known, is the S.exe column on sex and relationships in games, which ran in the early 2010s on Rock Paper Shotgun. I see a ton of still pretty unnuanced and frankly pretty boring takes on this stuff on Twitter. It's not Twitter's fault, that's just how Twitter goes. But none of that kind of discourse that I see tends to hold a candle to the complexity of her coverage from almost a decade ago. So, for example, here's a little a section of one of her articles on Nina Freeman's super excellent How Do You Do It, in which she concludes, quote, "It's very easy to fetishize teen girls in video games, but the most interesting work is being done by the game designers who want to convey meaning to other women about their own experiences or fantasies. As soon as you let go of the fixation on looking at teenage girls' bodies and start to think about how girls actually feel about their own desires and how they want to be empowered, much more exciting things can be done." Just a little taste of a little conclusion of that super, super cool RPS column. So do go look up that in the archive. It's still out there. Okay, Cara, that was a bit of a chunky intro, but you've done a lot of stuff and I barely touched on it. So I hope you're okay with me featuring some of your older work there. Is there anything you want to add or update or amend in terms of this account of your work?
No, I mean, I'm just this way because I have a lot of interests and they're really just very broad and spread out. And, one of the things that I haven't really got into in my work as of yet, I guess maybe a little bit in God of War, but I am a history buff and I'm wildly interested in history, and that hasn't been reflected in my work so far. But yeah, the reason why you're surprised at all of these things I've done is really because I can't pay attention for more than 5 seconds to one thing. So
you have brought a cool thing into our listening audience today, and I wonder if you could share with us what it is.
Yeah, so I suggested we talk about A Dictionary of Angels by Gustav Davidson, which is really responsible for not only kind of broadening my cultural horizons when I was very young, but it also kind of gave me this taste of how ancient the practice of world building and storytelling really is in general human civilization. You know, it really kind of put in perspective that this is not a new craft. It's not something that like I should expect to, you know, fundamentally impact or change. I'm just a little dot in an ocean of like, you know, people who've been doing this craft for a very, very long time. And so because I was interested in telling stories from a very, very young age, it really fired my imagination at like how deeply people had thought about the world of angels and demons and how they had thought about this constant ongoing drama between God and Satan and everyone who's in that little army, you know, like, I mean, it's not little, really. It's vast and massive, and it doesn't just span Christian religion. It spans Islamic, you know, kind of stuff, and Jewish stuff, and you know, even further into like occultism, and you know, apparently, like one of the popes wrote an occult manual according to this dictionary, and it's like, you know, obviously we can't even think about a pope writing like, you know, a witchcraft manual now. Like that's ridiculous. Like how would that ever happen? He would be immediately kicked out. So there's a lot in here, you know, it's huge as a book. So it's always really fired my imagination.
So just to sort of set the scene for our listeners, it's by Gustav Davidson, who was born in 1895 in Poland, and then sort of moved to America and is now known as an American poet, writer, and publisher. So it was published in 1967. I don't know if that's a mark of it being like a life's work, but yeah, describes it as an angelology. I read this great Amazon review of it. First stop if you are interested in angels, good or bad. Which
good or bad,
great.
Yes.
The whole gamut is in there. So tell me, when did you first discover the Dictionary of Angels?
I had a really wonderful English teacher, which I think, you know, is the first stop for anyone who became a writer. I think I was just very lucky to have an English teacher called Miss Linda Powell. And she not only was like amazing because she was clearly fundamentally always turning up at school dressed in full Gothic outfits. When I was 14 years old, she would turn up to her classroom in like flowing, romantic, Gothic kind of Kate Bush outfits. And she would gesture wildly at things and be like very kind of theatrical and performative. But her whole classroom was decked out in like Gothic, like pictures of like Interview with the Vampire and pictures of productions of Frankenstein plays. And there was a picture of I think it was when there's like a production of like the Royal Shakespeare Company had done Hamlet, I think, and there was a really famous poster of that Hamlet with your guy, I can't remember, he's like the famous one that became an English director, but like he played Hamlet that year, and there's a poster of him like looking up at the ceiling, and he's like covered in blood, like it's just like blood coming down over his head into his like shirt, and he's like kind of holding his hands up at the sky, and it was all very like gory, and she'd put like fake cobwebs in the corners of the classroom, and it was all absolutely an experience. Like it was narrative design. You walked into the classroom and you expected something to happen, and she was wonderful. And she really, obviously, she got me into like all sorts of fiction at the time. Like she would lend me the Vampire Chronicles books, and she would lend me all sorts of Gothic fiction. Like I read The Monk at a very young age, which was like maybe too young, but it was amazing. But yeah, there's all sorts of like amazing, you know, kind of discoveries I made there. And one of the things that she had on her desk, I remember, was this blue paper, like massive blue paperback tome of A Dictionary of Angels. And it was because she was writing a novel that used this as a kind of source book almost. And I, you know, I don't know if she ever published it. I don't know if she ever did, but honestly, she lent it to me. And my whole brain melted down because I was like this little girl who grew up in the Church of Scotland, which is like a very, very mild Scottish church, that Protestant church. that didn't really, it was very lax. There's no kind of, I think in America, like this idea of like Christianity and Protestant religion is very harsh because it comes from that Puritan background. But in Scotland, it's like, oh, like, do you want a piece of cake? Kind of Eddie Izzard style, you know, it's like very lovely. And if you don't turn up to church, like, it's like, okay, well, you can come next week. You know, like there's not really much there in terms of harsh rules. And I was always a nuisance in Sunday school because I was always asking where the dinosaurs were in the Garden of Eden. But ultimately, I stopped going to church because I was bullied so badly at school. I ended up not believing in God, which was like kind of a moment for me. So by the time I was 14, I was very kind of isolated from religion in general. And I haven't really gone back to religion at all either. And I respect people who are Christian, who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who you know, really believe in this God. And I'm still kind of looking for the signs that one exists. Like, I'm very agnostic. I'm not like, oh, God doesn't exist. I'm like, if you could exist, like I can accept that maybe something could happen there. But in general, I'm kind of agnostic. But I kind of discovered this book, and it opened my kind of brain to the idea that, you know, not only did all these religions share these kind of common, like kind of threads and common kind of, you know, stories about, you know, their origins and like where like all of these kind of beings were living and what they were getting up to. But, you know, it also kind of just made me think, wow, like this is kind of like a series of secrets that, you know, if you're interested in it, you can kind of get into it. It was very like during that era of my life, I was like really into like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, and like all the Indiana Jones movies are just like this stuff, like Jewish apocrypha and like little kind of stories about the origin of like Jesus and what Jesus was up to at this time, and like the Old Testament kind of secrets and mysticism, and you know and it also kind of brought me into the idea that someone chose the books for the Bible. Someone chose a canon and excluded the other books, and the other books you can still read them, and like, you know, sometimes it's really obvious why those books were excluded. For example, there was like some people believe that there was like a one of the apostles, there's a female apostle, and you know that was excluded from the canon of the Bible. And so, you know, I'm sure everyone regards that as being like heretical thought, but I also just was really interested in the fact that there was like a way you would tell stories, an official, so it was like one side is like the canon, so it's like the Marvel universe, and the other side is like fanfic, you know what I mean? Like there's a divide between the canon and the fanfic. And it just made me aware of the fact that fanfic is actually also like very, very powerful. And it's like really thin line between the canon and the fanfic. So, yeah.
And so what I really like about that is how that charms with something that Davidson explains himself in the introduction to A Dictionary of Angels. So in the beginning of the book, he says that he read the sentence, "And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets." And he says that he thought, who are these 7 like angels that stand before God? Has any biblical scholar identified them? And like, what order do they stand in? Why 7? What were their names? And that was sort of the beginning of his going like hold up. Like, you know, they call, you know, Barney and Grubble and you know, Plod. That's a really, really deep cut reference to sort of British culture there. I'm sorry. But yeah, so I think what's really, when we spoke about this thing that you were going to bring to the podcast and over email, you described it as like suggesting a massive cross-cultural predilection towards collective world building pleasure. And I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that.
So one of the things that makes me really mad is when people talk about the quote unquote marvelization of culture currently. And I am like, are you ignoring the fact that not only do we in the West live in an Abrahamic culture, which is that is what this is mythologizing, you know, beings that may or may not exist, and, you know, could have existed thousands of years ago, and we're still telling those like movies are still being made about like Jesus and the apostles and all that sort of stuff. Mary Magdalene, all of these figures are huge in our culture. But not only that, before that, there was like the Celtic, like there was like the Ulster cycle, and the Ulster cycle was again like people going, okay, these heroic figures exist in our culture. Or I actually did quite a bit of research into this, and a lot of the time people will say to me, you're taking this too seriously. In the Ulster cycle, for example, people didn't believe these like figures existed. They're not a religion. This is a storytelling culture. And all the scholars would tell me every single time, like, Scathach is not a real person. People regarded her as made up. Like, they just made her up and they like to tell stories about her. So the best comparison is the Marvel universe. People don't believe that Captain America exists. He is a symbol of how our values are now, and people like to tell stories about him. And the same is true for the Ulster cycle. People now go, oh, like they believed in these gods. And they also said the same could be true of like Roman gods and goddesses. They were storytelling culture. Yeah, they made these shrines to them, but really they were just showing off. A lot of these places were kind of like follies even. And so a lot of this is kind of interesting to me simply because I really feel like that's an ahistorical thing to say, is to say that the Marvel style of storytelling is new. It isn't new. The only thing that's new is that someone found a way to monetize it and make it an IP, which is different. That's a late capitalism thing, right? We've got these kind of traditions of worldwide storytelling that have been going for thousands of years. And I think this book is a very good demonstration of that because, clearly we haven't heard of like Liwet, who in Mandaean lore is the angel of love and invention. Like we haven't heard of that, but we've heard of Lilith and we've heard of Satan and we've heard of all of those other canon characters, and we kind of vaguely know what they do and what they get up to. So, like there's a lot going on in this book that I feel like is a collective pleasure of kind of fanfic storytelling and world building that we all kind of do, and everyone has the capability to add to that catalog. So yeah,
it makes me think of now I'm not referring to this as a genuine anthropological resource in any way, shape, or means, but Terry Pratchett's collaboration with some scientists and anthropologists whose practices I don't actually super respect. I've tried to read books of theirs before and I found them a little bit limited. But he did a fun collaboration with them on a series which began with the Globe, and which sort of uses the Discworld to sort of investigate like our world in a sort of more direct way than the sort of gentle satire of the Discworld in general. He says the anthropologists got it wrong when they named our species Homo sapien, wise man. In any case, it's arrogant and big-headed thing to say, wisdom being one of our least evident features. In reality, we are Pan Narans, the storytelling chimpanzee. And yeah, that is something I remember reading when it must have been when it came out. So I was a late teenager or my early 20s, and it just making my brain go, like actually, yes, it's one of the oldest practices that exists and has a lot to do with how we have developed as a species, as a people, as a globe. And just as you say, that certainly this book and much of our conversation is coming from a kind of Western and certainly like Judeo-Christian kind of founding. In every culture, there are stories told that are about these sort of figures who are maybe a bit magical or a bit godlike or are elders or ancestors, and they are just ways of reflecting on ourselves and who we are and the struggles within ourselves as expressed as, sides, as you're sort of saying here.
Lords of Shouting, also called Masters of Howling. The Lords of Shouting consist of 1,550 myriads of angels, all singing glory to the Lord. They are led by the angel Jeduthun. One of the first things I thought when I encountered this was it seemed more like fiction, like it seemed more like it wasn't something that anyone could ever take seriously. But weirdly, as I've got older, I think I take this as more of a kind of something that you have to respect in a way that, I know a lot of people now who do have religion, and I have to kind of respect that. So a lot of this is like, you can take this as a kind of fun reading exercise, but to someone this is special. To someone this is sacred. To someone out there, this is something that they care about. Not necessarily a lot of it is, still in religion. Like a lot of it has like kind of fallen out of, worship, and a lot of it has fallen out of like kind of general canon, for example. I have kind of learned that to someone somewhere, a lot of this is like very serious, which I think is interesting considering if you think about games culture now, in particular, what we've seen, I think, in the past kind of few decades is that people take games too seriously. It used to be like it was a kind of family thing, especially when Nintendo first kind of came onto the market. Like Nintendo was like very kind of playful and family oriented, and they still are, but the market has kind of matured into kind of trying to cater to people who are much older. I think now they still try and grab that kind of 25-year-old male kind of demographic, but there's a lot kind of there where you're going, you know, people on the internet especially take our storytelling medium a little too seriously sometimes, and they are kind of really into the lore, and they are into like researching like whether you've like accidentally let a plot hole happen, or they like go in forums and then like investigate like this and that and the other thing, and like, they're very, very kind of into all of this stuff. And it makes me think a lot about like how storytelling itself is something that people take very, very seriously. Not religion seriously, but it is a kind of similar vibe where like you kind of, you start to kind of over-identify with some things in stories these days. And, like if you've ever tried to disparage Zack Snyder on the internet, for example, you'll know what I'm talking about, where it's like that guy's movies, like they have followers that are like right, it's very, very intense. And it's not like, these things are like a matter of life and death. And like, although I guess to be fair, most stories do address issues of life and death, and they are kind of very kind of important and serious topics sometimes. But like people do take this kind of lore and world building very seriously, even if it isn't a religion. And I think that's an interesting aspect of humanity, is going like, you can't talk about Captain America that way. And it's like, he's fictional, like he doesn't exist. Like we made him up. We all talk about him as if he's real, but he isn't real, And then there's this kind of vibe about like the storytelling kind of world building like cultural elements are becoming like further towards religion, especially in games. I think like that kind of like, I am who I am because I consume this thing,
And this text is in that really interesting space between religion, which, as you say, we're not saying is made up. We're saying it's ineffable, and people have tried to put words to it, right? And then there's the storytelling that we do, which is very effable, like it's, we made those words, and, certainly something happens between audience and player and words and writer, right? From which new things spring. But it's not the same relationship, even though some people sort of lead into it, maybe perhaps in similar ways.
Yes. And, obviously because I grew up within Protestant religion or Protestant culture, I mean, even if you aren't religious and you grew up in Scotland, you're deeply affected by religious outlooks. I mean, I would say Scotland is a secular country these days, but we all grew up in a family that came from like a non-secular tradition. And, that could be Catholic or Protestant normally. Sometimes it's Hindu, sometimes it's Muslim, sometimes it's Jewish, but ultimately we're all coming from a culture that is defined by those kind of outlooks. And what's interesting to me is like you say, in Catholic kind of outlooks, that's, you know, the text itself of the Bible is very sacred. And it's so sacred, you know, that it needs to be, you know, administered by someone actually in the church. And in Protestant religion, we were like, oh, well, we want to be able to have a personal relationship with that text. And so a lot of it is like, you know, how sacred is the word? And again, like fandom culture also functions on that kind of level as well. Like, you know, what is canon and what isn't canon, and like how sacred is this word compared to this word, like who ships who kind of stuff. I mean, like, I mean, when I was a kid, I was like shipping Mary Magdalene with Jesus, which is like, obviously everyone in the church would be horrified. But like, there's all kinds of stuff like going on there where it's like levels of sacred, you know, how many levels of sacred stuff are there? And, you know, I think it's like just natural for people to gravitate towards storytelling. So even if, like, you know, as people who grew up Protestant, like believe in God, like it's like how many layers of like the storytelling do you believe in, and do you kind of consider the canon is like really important, right? And so I think that people just naturally want to storytell together about something and consider like what is and isn't like the thing they want to listen to, right?
You've been talking so eloquently about the book itself, but maybe I should begin to turn us towards game design and, you know, narrative design, game development, whichever part of the practice you want to speak to. But I wonder if you want to talk to us a little bit about how you sort of want to offer a dictionary of angels to others. Like, what do you think we can learn as, you know, makers of games or makers of whatever it is that we make from a dictionary of angels?
So I think there's a tendency, especially in games, to look towards like the wild and absurd and like kind of like the super, like the, I guess for a better kind of word, the supernatural, like this, like the magical and like the weird and like the things that you wouldn't be able to film in, say, like with a TV camera. Like we kind of naturally gravitate towards like the magical and wonderful because we have all sorts of VFX that can kind of like show those things in a kind of like extraordinary way. And I think that temptation is good because obviously we want to like use our medium to the fullest, and I think that's really cool. There is a whole other debate as to like, you know, graphical fidelity and like realism and all sorts of, you know, which engine are you using? Because if you're using Unity, that sucks, you know, that kind of discourse. But what's interesting to me is that human beings generally, I find as a storyteller, human beings do need an element of groundedness or relatability in order to get into a story. And so when you make like a story about like a supernatural like fairy or whatever, and it doesn't look humanoid, people find it very difficult to relate to that character, right? Like if it doesn't have a face, or it doesn't have like a job, or it doesn't have like a, you know, that kind of stuff. And there's a definite temptation, I think, in games to kind of try to go there because like that's like something that no one has ever seen before, or like, you know, it's magical and whimsical and wonderful. The thing that I've seen work the best for character development in games is when you give them, you know, they have to have a kind of fallibility about them. They have to have kind of something wrong with them. They have to have like a motivation, like what they most want. And all those things have to kind of just be like, you know, your next door neighbor could have them. And that's what I think this whole book gives you, is like it's filled with the most magical, extraordinary, ridiculous beings that people have like over the years just been like, well, there must be like, you know, an angel of love and invention, right? And you're like, okay, like cool, you know, and then people are like, well, okay, but like I can't relate to that. Like I don't know what that's like. Like what's their job? And then that's like how the world building starts, is when the people start to be like, well, how can I know them? And they can only know these characters through humanizing them and giving them more kind of human qualities, right? And that's when we get into storytelling. That's when we get into like people really getting into that. Because I read out earlier about Lilith, and the reason I think Lilith is so interesting is that she is the evil ex-wife archetype. She's the evil first wife that Adam divorced and then had the nice, Madonna type wife in Eve. And she's the good one. I mean, I guess technically she also kind of is bad, but like there's a lot of ex-wives going on here is what I'm trying to say. And I think that's really, really relatable. Like, obviously that's so relatable. Like everyone wants to think the first wife is evil. And so it's not really about kind of going like, oh, how extraordinary and crazy could they be and how magical could they be? It's about like, how much could I think that this person lives next door? And it's pretty obvious to me that a lot of like, like very serious Jewish men sat around and went, okay, this is who Lilith is, right? And like, because they know that person, right? And so there's a lot going on there. I think that's really wonderful. And there's something about that kind of like, way of thinking about stuff that makes these angels real. And I think the realness of them kind of makes it like stick in the mind and makes people love to think about it. And that's why they become important to us. So I learn a lot from this book just by going, okay, what's the element of this angel that I can relate to? Because the more that I can relate to, the more they stick in the canon. And that's why Lilith, I think, has persisted. She's the evil ex-wife. She's she hates babies. Like everyone knows a woman who doesn't want to have children, so that she's that late, like that kind of thing. And so I don't know, I just think that that's a really good like character development lesson, is going like, could you know this person? We all know this. What, like, there has to be a kind of archetype there that we kind of can fit them into, so we can feel like we know them and relate to them and know how they fit in the story. So yeah, that's why I really love it.
For sure. And I think it's just a really like natural lead into a practice which a lot of people who tell stories and games do when thinking about characters. I use character sheets. Not everyone uses the exact same thing. Some people like to give their characters star signs or tarot readings, that kind of thing. That's not really my vibe. I have very simple like forms that I make and I just have little lines that, help you like provoke a thought about how this person is kind of mundane or has had a journey to get here. I did an interview for the podcast recently with Nicole Hay, who brought in perfume. And I was like, damn, I want to add, what does this person smell like day to day to my character sheets? Or like, what is this person's favorite smell? Because it actually is a whole different thing. It's not like, what are they around and encountering? That's more like, what is part of their past that sort of stuck with them? And yeah, it's those little things, which this sort of a dictionary of angel, it has sometimes a tiny like entry for an angel will have the most mind-blowing piece of like specificity. And suddenly you're imagining this angel. And I think that that line between sort of character development and a dictionary of angels, I think, is really beautiful and really useful.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously the like title Lords of Shouting or Masters of Howling, as written in the Dictionary of Angels, is very evocative as a beginning, right? But what I think is also very important to note about this book and about narrative design in general is that it also teaches you that everyone has to be related to everyone else, not in a kind of familial way, but in a bond way. They have to have a relationship with other people. Otherwise, like, and another temptation that people have in games is to go, oh, they're all strangers to each other. You just met them. And it's like, okay, but like, it is really, really important to figure out where, like, how are they going to relate to other people bonds wise? Because the important thing about Lilith is she's the bride of Satan, right? And she was Adam's ex-wife. And that's already created what I would say is a conflict that's really interesting, where you've got Adam, who's supposed to be all good. His ex-wife is an like evil ex-wife who then went on to marry Satan. And so you've got this ready-made like argument there that I love that it already pre-exists. So a lot of this is like going, okay, like this angel is like the angel of Thursday. What relation do they have to the angel of Wednesday? They probably have a bit of a beef with the angel of Friday because Friday is a cool day, right? So like there's probably something going on there. So there's a lot of like kind of hierarchical concerns, and there's a lot of kind of interesting like ins and outs of all of this stuff. Maybe like what happens if one of the lords of shouting loses their voice? Like all of that kind of stuff like indicates that their relationships are going to shift around a lot, and that's really important to think about when you're world building and when you're doing narrative design, is going like, what's their relationship to everyone else? They should have an interesting relationship with each other. It can't just be like, oh, they're my brother or they're my mother. It has to be like, but also like they were the person I shared a cell with in jail. Like that kind of thing is going to make your characters really, really pop. So a lot of like this book is kind of about that too.
Shout out to the most interesting relationship between characters I think is out there. I'm going to go Deep Space Nine now.
I knew it would come.
The relationship between Odo and Quark.
You take the form of an animal, you're going to end up behaving like one. What was it? A Klingon Targ? A Trellin crocodile?
Like the complexity of the relationship between I guess, I don't want to call Odo a cop, right? That feels like not it. Custodian, I guess.
What was I thinking? How could I have fooled myself into believing she could ever love someone like me?
I actually think that Quark's impact on him makes him draw away from the cop side as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Look, the last thing I want to do is interfere with your personal life, but this just isn't any good for either of us.
Quark being the lovable criminal, I suppose, the rascal, never quite on the side of criminality, which is harming people in a real way. He can't bring himself to do it. And the criminality is only really defined by Odo. So Quark sort of needs Odo for his personality, right? To even exist, like to be a cheeky criminal, he needs the custodian. Watch all of DS9 just for their relationship, ignore all of the others, and I think that you'd have a really beautiful experience.
For a minute there, I thought you were talking to me as a friend.
Nah.
Right, so I am going to begin to wrap us up because we've had a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for bringing a dictionary of angels to us. I'm going to ask if there's anything that we haven't talked about that you really sort of wanted to bring to the table. And if not, do you have anything you'd like to promote or any socials that we should follow you on?
Right. So if you look in the appendix of this book, just before we go, it literally has so if you go to appendix on page 343, the archangels and angels of the 7 days of the week are there. And honestly, it's a table of our archangels of Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, or whatever, all of the cure angels, and it has what does it say? A table showing the names of the angels governing the 7 days of the week, along with their sigils, zodiac signs, and the heavens ruled by these angels. Okay, so they have got a sigil that someone sat down and was like, this is the sigil of this angel. And it looks like his signature to me.
They're so intense. They look like, I don't even know. Some of them look like hieroglyphs. Some of them look like someone is imagining how music is written, but never really saw it before.
Yeah, I mean, this is some Last Crusade, stuff, right? It's all stuff that Sean Connery would put in the Grail Diary. And to me, this was wonderful kind of thinking about like how would they write? Like, what does their signature look like? Like, what is their like zodiac sign? Like, what a strange thing to think about an angel. But there's a lot going on here. And if you go even deeper into here, you get the 72 angels bearing the mystical name of God, and then a word that I absolutely cannot pronounce. According to the Kabbalah, from the Magus by Barrett, there's a lot of, like there's, the mystical name of God. Like, I mean, what is this stuff? I mean, when I was a kid, this just blew my mind that people would go this far to kind of, document all of this stuff. The 72 names of God in Hebrew tongue is wonderful. I just like a lot of this kind of sacred work is just like mind-blowingly beautiful, but also I just feel like there's a lot kind of going on here where it's like, this is a kind of way of developing how to think about like these magical beings. And there's the seals of the 7 angels are in here that someone has drawn. The conjuration of the 6th mystery with the seal of the Power Angels. Power Angels? Oh my God. Like, I want to know what the Power Angels are, kind of stuff. But yeah, and then my favorite part when I was a kid was that there is actually an alphabet of angels in here as well, which I think might be Jewish, but it's essentially like an alphabet that I'm supposing the angels write in. I don't know. It seems almost, to me at least, it seems almost like, the Lord of the Rings, all the religions were doing this kind of stuff. And like, maybe that just made Tolkien sit down and go, okay, like I need a language and it needs to look like this, as well. So like this kind of template for world building is just so good. Like every time I open this book, I think, oh, like I should put a character in like this, because like this kind of dictionary of angels has suggested like all sorts of wonderful things that could happen. So yeah, like again, like the human imagination is wonderful. I always think to myself, like every church is supposed to be like, built for the glory of God. But every time I go into an amazing church, I just think, aren't humans wonderful,
Number 1, the appendix is incredibly intense, beautiful, and wonderful in this book. Number 2, if someone on my story team brought this kind of work to me, this is the point at which I'll be going, okay, time to put away the Google Docs and actually start some writing.
Exactly right. You've gone too far. Like this is like a little too much. I mean, I would definitely Tom Bombadil too far for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would help Tolkien to put the pen down. But yeah, no, I honestly feel like every time I look at this stuff, I'm like, well, someone had some time to think about things, right? So
wonderful. So we're going to do our best. I don't know if this will happen, but we're going to do our best to find, because this is such a well-established and sort of older text. There are a few PDFs which I think it's okay to link to, or at least easy to link to, that we'll place into the liner notes so people can look at like an excerpt of this book at the very least. I think you can also look inside on Amazon, if you go there and click the look inside button, if you just want to take a look at some of the wonders therein. So Cara, just to wrap up, is there anything that we should play, places we should follow you, things you'd like to promote? I mean, shout out to God of War Ragnarok, which just won a bunch of awards, which you worked on. Anything else?
So you can pre-order The Final Girls in print, in trade paperback print, over at the Dark Horse website, if you are interested in that sort of thing. Again, it's like very in the Celtic Ulster cycle mythology style storytelling, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, and also in characters who speak in Doric, which is where I'm from in Aberdeen. And yeah, like I think that comic is like one of the hardest things I've ever made, but it's also one of the most rewarding things I made with Sally Cantorino, who's an incredible artist, and Joe McGill, who's an incredible letterer, and Gab Contreras, who is an incredible colorist, and all the people who helped, including Katie West, our editor. So yeah, like it was a really, really tough project, but it's finally coming out in print. It used to just be in digital, but now you can pre-order it. But that's it. I really be happy if you played Ragnarok and told me what you thought. A lot of the kind of like storytelling system in there is something that I worked on, so let me know if you like it. But apart from that, yeah, like I have a website, it's caraellison.co.uk. If you want to get in touch or see any of my work, like it's all links on there. But yeah, apart from that, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of One Cool Thing from Die Gute Fabrik. As usual, leave that rating or review where you can. If this time was of value to you, that's the way to say thank you. I'll be back soon with another episode speaking with another cool thinker and maker in the field of video games. And in the meantime, check out Die Gute Fabrik on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. I actually do think that our wonderful assistant producer Unaming is setting up a TikTok sometime soon, so that may even be out there now. Try us on TikTok. Otherwise, this podcast was produced, edited and sound designed by Tom Wally. Additional production and research by Unaming Kavanagh. And our theme music is by Nick Ellis, whose music you can find under the name 10B on Bandcamp. That's TENBY. Stay thoughtful, friends. Take care. Goodbye.